My name is June Wall. I'm an education consultant specialising in e-learning and libraries with many years' experience in the classroom at all levels of education, as well as a successful implementation of flipped learning for my class. And it's in that capacity that I'm actually presenting a session at FlipCon Australia in 2015, and the reason why you may be watching this now is one of your expectations of looking at this and thinking and reflecting about it prior to my session at FlipCon Australia 2015. I'll focus on the concepts of deeper learning and the preparation to develop student knowledge and skills for the future. Understanding these concepts and thinking about how you can implement a change of learning in your classroom are some of the core elements needed for success. Historically, an apprentice as a learner worked alongside his master. While the relationship was that of a master to novice, it was a relationship where both knew it was about passing on knowledge to that apprentice could eventually move on to become a journeyman and then a master himself. Students in our classrooms often have more knowledge or ability to exponentially expand their knowledge than we give credit for. Our curriculum is often heavily laden with content. This is often being considered to be a linear acquisition process where the teacher is the expert and the source of knowledge. In a flipped learning environment, students share and co-construct their knowledge and are able to be recognised by teachers and other students for their expertise, while the teacher's role is one of learning designer or architect. Both work alongside each other. The student works to build his or her knowledge, and the teacher works to design processes or environments where that knowledge can be built. Reflecting on how I implemented a flipped classroom, as well as my view of myself as a teacher and how my students saw their role in the classroom of what was a relatively traditional school, confirmed the preparation needed before the students were ready for a fully flipped learning model. Students in that school at that time had a reasonable expectation that all teachers provided information, directed the class activities, responded to the teacher in a specific format, either in class or through assessments, and the teacher in turn would provide feedback to the student as an individual and as a class, both in formalised and informal manner. It was a classroom set up for group learning or whole class discussion, and the students understood the role of the teacher and their role in that environment. We were moving them to an environment where students needed to alter their view of themselves as learners from passive acceptors to active seekers. They also needed to view themselves as teachers and experts in their own right. They had some core content, but also a wide range of options they were able to select from and determine their own path within the option. Students became journeymen rather than apprentices in their own learning by teaching other students and discussing their ideas equally with students and teachers. They determined how and when they provided information to the teacher within assessment parameters, and the physical classroom environment also changed as a result in the change in dynamics within the class. Everyone was a co-learner. Feedback was sought and valued by all members of the learning team, that is, the class itself. And it's in that perspective that I'm asking you to think about the changes that were required in order for the students to move from that traditional mode to the more flexible and flipped mode. Change takes time. We all know that, but we sometimes forget that students have preconceptions as to their role, and our role. Preparing students for change is just as important as being the change yourself. These 4 areas of knowledge, skills, attitudes and empowerment overlap at times, but essentially students need to have time and processes to embrace that the development of knowledge is their responsibility, and depending on how the teacher designs the learning, it can also be their responsibility to select appropriate knowledge. Students also need to have the skills to learn. As teachers, our responsibility is to help them understand what skill sets they need, how to acquire those skills, and then be able to put them into place. They also need the types of attitudes that will make them want to learn and do so in a different way, not in the acceptor or the passive way that they've been used to. And finally, that extra bit of empowerment was important. They needed to feel that they can do as needed and have the right to do as they need. On the note of empowerment then, how do you go about empowering students? We could have a whole session just on that. However, what I did during this period of time in preparing the students was to have a lot of discussion with the students, articulation about the purposes of the changes and what we were doing. We had surveys, we had questions, we had open forums about what we were trying to achieve and what would be that end product. And as a consequence of that, there was a lot of listening from my part, from the part of me as the teacher, to what it was they were concerned about, what they wanted, and how I could enable that within the environment that we had. So ultimately, what this part of the process enabled was a relationship building exercise. And that's essentially what this empowerment led to. So the students needed to think, and I needed to think about what was going to be different, what chasm was opening in front of them. There were a few that they weren't used to. They were used to rubrics, but they weren't used to rubrics increasing in complexity and student expectations increasing, while still allowing students to decide for themselves as to what they were aiming for. And what I mean by that is that the rubrics themselves became more difficult and much more complex the further into the course of the program that we moved, because I had higher expectations of the students as they moved along in their process. The next part, and that's the part that probably the students found the most frustrating to start off with, was that of questioning, because questioning would be the primary means of inquiry and the primary means of encouraging students' reflective thinking. This meant that I would question absolutely everything that they provided, and I expected them to question everything as well. The next aspect that was something they had to get used to would be that the students had to be responsible in every way for their own learning process. So consequently, some aspects of project management techniques were taught and used, specifically time management, benchmark meetings, reports or updates on where they were up to. They were scheduled in at different times throughout the year. This meant the students needed to understand the value of thinking about their own thinking and reflecting about that. They also would have choice of topic, how to represent the information, taking into account their audience. So in some instances, they needed to become teacher to teach the other students, and at other times it was mentor, or further still, a traditional student submitting work to the teacher. So there was a lot of expectations on the students, and in a flipped learning classroom, there are expectations on the students to take that responsibility themselves. The teacher, on the other hand, is the architect in this process. So as the architect of this learning design, the teacher's responsibility was to start with what was the content and what were the outcomes that the students were expected to know at the end of the course of study, so at the end of the year. Once that was determined for the particular subject that was being taught, what was going to be the best way for the class to be structured? So in that instance, that was at the point where it was determined that a flipped learning model would be the best way to allow for the core and optional units within the subject itself. Once that was known, then it was determined what skills would the students need. From there, an initial program of skill development was designed for the students to undertake at the beginning part of the year, and only then was the program able to be fully integrated with knowledge, skills, attitudes, and the curriculum outcomes that they required. So that was the teacher's responsibility as the architect of the design itself. Designing a learning program is different for all teachers, and making decisions on types of learning in classrooms is based on situation and student needs. However, in a flipped classroom, inquiry learning is central to the concept of deeper learning and creative and critical thinking that is core to future learning, or what used to be known as 21st century learning. mastery of the core content here for deeper learning means what is something useful or meaningful that is done with that particular content. According to the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation paper on deeper learning, and I quote, "The brain must develop the internal wiring necessary to process information in non-routine ways. Deeper learning activities should be structured to give students multiple opportunities over time to apply knowledge in a range of challenging tasks. In essence, the learner moves from the novice to the expert level within the sphere of knowledge and expertise in question." And deeper learning, and this first part of deeper learning, is primarily for the reason for the flipped learning model that was utilised in this instance. So that mastery of academic content is core. The next one you need to look at is the thinking critically and solving complex problems. This is actually really important, and all of the deeper learning factors that we're looking at in this particular instance, compared to the Australian Curriculum's general capability statements. However, the critical and thinking and complex problem solving is actually most important in this instance, because students need to apply tools and techniques learned across all the disciplines to formulate and solve problems, especially in relation to creativity, non-linear thinking and persistence. Students need to work collaboratively. They need to cooperate to develop, build and implement solutions to problems or projects. And this needs to be authentic collaboration, not just for the sake of it. So they need to be able to come together, to work together for a particular purpose where they have identified the types of skills and people needed for that team to be successful. They need to communicate effectively. Students need to clearly organise their data, findings and their thoughts. Ultimately, they need to know how to learn, so they need to learn how to learn. And in this instance, it's about them monitoring their learning and directing their own learning. And in the flipped model that we're all looking at, students do precisely this. And finally, we want students to develop an academic mindset. And in this instance, students develop positive attitudes and beliefs about themselves as learners. Students are committed to completion, meeting their goals and doing quality work, and thus persevere to overcome obstacles. Know that recognition of success as a student is usually through exams and tests, but that a question from that test asked of that successful student 6 months later could be unable to be answered. Deeper learning engages learners because it is valued in a public space, and the quality of the work is valued implicitly by the learner. It is this doing more or better that I believe is at the core of developing lifelong learners. Part of that development of those lifelong learners is being able to work within relationships with and as co-learners. So the characteristics of a co-learner is one where all knowledge is valued, there's reciprocal value of knowledge sharers, that they care for each other as people and as co-learners, and that there is an area of trust and learning from one another that happens in a co-learning relationship. In order for those co-learning relationships to be developed in the classroom environment needs to have power that is shared amongst the co-learners. It needs to incorporate individualised and social learning. It needs to have collective and individual meaning making and identity exploration. There needs to be this development of a community of practice within situated learning, and there needs to be real-world engagement and action as a result of that real-world engagement. So what does all this have to do with flipped learning? Preparing to flip your classroom is not only about understanding the processes for learning in this environment, but also understanding yourself as a teacher and as a learner. Preparation includes more than a nod to change management practices, but recognition of the value of managing that change and understanding the change in relationships within the classroom. I know that the journey I undertook in my flipped classroom was just as much about recognising who I am as a teacher and learner as it was in designing the best learning environment I could for a specific cohort of students at that time. So before you come to my session at the conference, I'd like you to think about who you are as a teacher and who you are as a learner. Thank you.